Hello everyone and welcome to an update for Wild Rift patch 6.3. A lot of you might not know, but in the patch notes for 6.3, it didn't actually tell us all of the changes and updates that were happening in the game. Funny enough, Riot actually released patch notes yesterday calling it patch 6.3a, but it actually was an update because these changes were already in the game. So in today's video, I'm going to quickly go through all of the changes that we missed in the patch notes for 6.3 and give you all my opinions. I've played well over 20 hours over the past few days of this new update, so I've got my opinions about the new runes and also boots changes that we're going to be talking about as well, which actually impacts the meta quite a bit. Before we go into that though, I just wanted to confirm the changes to Varus because there was a little bit of complication on the passive for Varus, what it actually meant and what this actually means for Varus as a champion. The basic of what actually happened to Varus is all that it did, it kept the ability power from the non-champion kills and also the champion kills, but the percentage of how much AD and AP you get went down from 30% down to 20%. So that's a really big difference as well if you take into consideration the W nerf as well, the on-hit damage on the second ability. This is also a pretty big nerf overall. You're still going to go the same build with Varus, which is going to include Nash's Tooth, Runa's Hurricane, and Riftmaker, because you still get so much ability power from your passive. But overall, this has been a big hit for Varus, and he's definitely not doing as much damage as what he was doing in the previous patch. So I've definitely moved him down in terms of the tier list. Now, if we go over to items, this is where really the big changes come on in. I did test a little bit on Radiant Virtue. I think Radiant Virtue is actually going to be very strong in a lot of tanks, even in the top lane, but there's a lot of tank supports which benefit from this a lot. Alistar is one of the main benefits of Radiant Virtue because when you use your ultimate, you're getting crazy damage resistant anyway, and you're getting so much healing as well. The healing actually benefits yourself a lot more than kind of the allies around you. So I think Radiant Virtue is going to be a big item that you can build on a lot of tank support. So keep an eye out for that one. But let's move on to the change that actually I don't think any of you really know. Some of you might know if you notice that all of the boots has a down arrow. I actually spoke to some people as well talking about some builds and talking about the meta. They didn't actually know that these changes were in the game until I told them. So that's why I want to focus on this video to talk about these changes. So every single one of the boots has been nerfed. The price of all the boots has stayed the same, but the stats are what's been nerfed. Gluttonous Greaves has lost 5 AD, and the same with Berserker's Greaves. So now Gluttonous Greaves only gives 30 AD, and Berserker Greaves only gives 15 AD. This is pretty big. I don't think this is really going to change too much for AD carries and just bruisers in general that like to build this, especially in the jungle. I still think, even though they lose 5 AD, I still think both of these boots are going to be completely fine. ADCs, I think, are still going to build Berserker's Greaves just because you can get the crazy amount of attack speed and the attacks are able to restore health on hit. But the big change now is Boots of Dynamism didn't lose any AD at all. It only lost +2 armor pen, so it went from 10 flat armor pen now down to 8. This is actually going to make Boots of Dynamism actually a lot more viable than what it was in the previous patch, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are even some AD carries like Jhin or even assassins in the jungle that are going to start building Boots of Dynamism instead of Gluttonous Greaves. Of course, the 5 AD is a lot bigger than losing just 2 armor pen. The armor pen in the early game is definitely going to help you out a lot as well, but this is the first time in a long time that we've had Gluttonous Greaves and Boots of Dynamism now giving the same AD. So now really the only difference is 7% Omnivamp or +8 armor pen. And most of the time you might think about it like the 8 armor pen in the early game is going to be a lot more beneficial for you. Sometimes the Omnivamp can help out, the extra healing can be very, very helpful, but definitely I would recommend testing out Boots of Dynamism if you're playing carries in the jungle, or even if you're playing champions like Jhin or champions that do a lot of burst damage, because that extra armor pen that you get in the early game is going to be very, very important. Boots of Mana lost 10 ability power, which you might think is quite a lot, but to be fair, this item still gives you 45 ability power, and these boots are still going to be very, very powerful. But losing 10 ability power is pretty damn crazy. It went down from 55 down to 45. And then Boots Lucidity lost 10 ability haste. So it still has the maximum health, it still has the mana regeneration, which I still think is the most important thing about these two boots. Both of these boots still give him mana regeneration, means that sometimes you can rush these boots and be able to stay in lane for a long amount of time. And that's why people still rush these boots, like Boots of Lucidity on supports and Boots of Mana in the mid lane. I think one slight change that I would make even more with these boots is maybe give mid laners a bit more options in the mid lane. Maybe give Boots Lucidity a little bit of ability power instead of giving it maximum health, because at the moment Lucidity boots are just stuck on supports and Boots of Mana just stuck on mid lane. Like, that's just always the boots that you're going to build, and it's never really that flexibility that you have. So that's the big changes there. Both of these boots are still going to be very powerful though, and they're still going to work the same. The biggest, and I mean the biggest nerf to boots are actually going to be to the defensive boots. So the maximum health is staying the same, the magic resist and the armor are staying the same, but both of the dissolve and the block passive now, you only reduce 3% damage in the early game. That is down from, I believe, yes, 7%. So from 7% in the early game down to only 3% damage reduction in the early stages of the game now. This is a big nerf to Baron laners and to tanks in general and bruisers that were rushing boots as a first item. A lot of tanks and a lot of bruisers would just rush plated steel caps or mercury treads and take a lot of reduced damage. This will help you against defending yourself against ganks and also help defending you against trades and kills that might happen during the lane phase. Of course, these boots are still going to scale and be incredibly powerful in the late stages of the game. Plated steel caps is still 10% and mercury treads is still 12%. But now that the reduction in the early game has gone, like I said, down from 7% down to only 3% damage reduction, I could definitely see some Baron laners now, champions like Aatrox, Riven, and Bessa, building something like Gluttonous Greaves or Boots of Dynamism in the early game because it gives you that extra bit of damage still, and then switch into something like Plated Steel Caps or Mercury Treads when the percentage of the damage reduction has been increased. So when you're playing against tanks now, when they're building things like Mercury Treads or even Plated Steel Caps as a first item, when you're playing someone like Teemo, for example, you're going to be dealing a lot of extra damage. I noticed this a lot. I was playing Ornn. I rushed boots to see how much damage I would take from Teemo, and Teemo was doing a crazy amount of damage in the early game. So I think these bully champions in the top lane, these champions that can benefit from boots like Gluttonous Greaves or even Boots of Mana, champions like Rumble, for example, are going to be really huge now in the Baron lane. And like I said, champions like Camille and Fiora that were rushing these defensive boots, trying to take less damage, got hit with a big nerf. And even though we did get the update to runes, which added Unshakable as a rune for tanks, this nerf to boots is actually a lot bigger than the new rune Unshakable. I have to tell you that for a fact. Tanks have been hit really hard in the top lane, and just tanks in general as well. You can think of like tank supports as well. You can't really rush plated steel caps and take a crazy amount of reduced damage anymore in the early stages of the game. So a really big change for plated steel caps. However, I do think the boots in general are still going to be very powerful because of the home guard changes. TP might be much more important now. I think a really nice meta thing that might happen is that top laners will now take teleport and they'll just rush their first item. They actually won't buy boots because they don't need to run back to lane anymore. Instead, they'll get more power from rushing their first item instead of going something like boots. And then you can look to try and build plated steel caps or mercury treads as a second item because it's been a little bit further into the game and you'll get more damage reduction. So keep an eye on how the meta shifts with this and definitely try out a few more things with boots. I think top laners now are just not really going to rush boots as a first item. Unless you don't take teleport, then obviously that movement speed is going to be very important to get back to lane as soon as possible. Then I wanted to give you a quick rundown on my thoughts on all of the runes. I didn't go through the runes in the patch notes for 6.3. Of course, it's been a few days now, and I've gotten to test out a lot of the runes and give you all my idea on these runes. First, let's talk about Dark Harvest. I think Dark Harvest is... I would say a very solid rune overall. I kind of find it similar to First Strike in a way. First Strike is a very big scaling rune that you want to try and get stacks in the early game and try and get as much gold as possible. Dark Harvest is a little bit different, where you want this on snowball champions in the early game and champions that can poker lock and deal a lot of damage in the early stages of the game. If you can get Dark Harvest stacking in the early game, and if you can keep getting that extra 10 per soul damage, the base damage on Dark Harvest, you can see that the AD and AP ratio that you get is pretty decent. So if you can get a few stacks in the early game, if you can get like, I would say like 10 stacks in 10 minutes, for example, is pretty good, or even more than that. Then you can start to do a lot of damage. Then the damage starts to scale a lot when it gets to the mid and the late game. However, if you're a very safe player that just likes to farm in the laning phase, or don't really like to take trades, or don't really like to take fights early on, I definitely wouldn't recommend Dark Harvest. If you take Dark Harvest and play very, very passive during the laning phase, then this rune is going to be completely useless. If you get like 1 or 2 stacks of Dark Harvest after like 10 minutes, then you're going to deal no damage with this rune. It's going to be very, very weak, and you're not really going to see the benefit from it at all. So it's going to change a lot of playstyles during the laning phase. If you're against a champion that has Dark Harvest, just make sure that you play safe, especially when you're below 50% health, because you don't want them to get a lot of stacks of Dark Harvest in the early game. For the domination tree, Chain Assault, there's actually some information of Chain Assault that actually isn't displayed on the text. So how Chain Assault works is a little bit different to something like Sudden Impact. Sudden Impact, when you use a dash, you have to damage an enemy champion for the true damage to come on in and for the ability to go on to cooldown. Chain Assault is different. When you hit an enemy with an ability, you only have 5 to 6 seconds to hit that champion with another ability or an auto attack, or it will go on cooldown. The cooldown doesn't start from when you hit a champion from when the icon gets reduced or gets removed from the champion. It starts from when you hit the champion on the ability. So the basics of how this works, if I take someone like Senna, for example, if I play Senna and if I hit a champion with my first ability, the 15-second cooldown will begin. Then if I hit a champion with an auto attack, the 6-second duration that I just mentioned that you have to hit or use an ability will be extended. And then when I hit the champion a second time with an ability or an auto attack, that 15-second cooldown will start. However, if I hit a champion with an ability, and if I don't hit them anymore, the 15-second cooldown will start when I hit the champion with the ability, but I only have 6 seconds until the rune basically becomes useless. This is actually a really, really big deal, and actually makes this rune pretty unreliable. As I mentioned, someone like Senna, if you walk up and just use your first ability, but you don't use an auto attack, this rune basically gets put on a 15-second cooldown. You have 6 seconds though to make sure that you can use this. I still think this is going to be very good on champions that can dash in or do have really, really big ability combos that can burst all at once. Champions like Aurora, for example, that you know that when she hits her first ability, she's going to hit her second ability, her third ability, sorry, and she's going to hit her first ability again. So you know that you're going to get a benefit from Chain Assault. But if you're playing someone like Brand, for example, that maybe you want to use your abilities to poke in the early game, but you can't follow up with your other abilities, you're just wasting a rune. This rune is just not going to be reliable. Like I said, it's very important that when you use an ability, you make sure that you auto attack or use another ability within 6 seconds, or the duration of Chain Assault just gets reset basically, and you're not going to benefit from the rune. The rune's then going to be on cooldown for like 10 seconds, and you're not going to be able to proc Chain Assault again until that 10 seconds are up. Tyrant is only good with Dark Harvest. Only take this rune with Dark Harvest. This rune is pretty shit otherwise. It has great synergy with Dark Harvest because it procs when you get champions below 50% health, which is the same as Dark Harvest, so they both proc at the same time, so you can do a nice bit of burst damage. Outside of that, don't take this rune. Not very good. The scaling's not great either. Overall, I'm pretty upset with how both the domination trees runes were. I thought that Chain Assault would be kind of similar to Sudden Impact, where if you can only really use the ability when you hit 2 abilities on a champion. Kind of like Sudden Impact, the dash only works when you hit an enemy champion. So I thought it'd be the same with that, with the marking of Chain Assault, but it's pretty bad. But yeah, Tyrant overall, pretty bad as well. For the Resolve tree, Unshakable, it's kind of confusing the way Unshakable works, because you'll look at the stats and you'll see that the stats are not really that high. But that's only because the stats that they're showing in-game for Unshakable is only showing you how many seconds that you're within 3 champions. and it doesn't show you the extra armor and magic resist that you're actually getting from this rune. I do think Nullifying Orb is a lot more reliable, even though the shield is not really that big, and I don't think the rune gives you really that much benefit. But if you're playing bruisers that only really build like 1 or 2 defensive items, then I think that's completely fine, especially now that I just mentioned with defensive boots being nerfed and some bruisers building offensive boots instead. It's a lot better to go Nullifying Orb instead of Unshakable. But Unshakable is still very good on a lot of tanks. You think of Ornn and Poppy, for example, that just gain a lot of stats overall. Basically, any tank that you're going to be building a lot of defensive stats on, it's still a really great rune. You still get a lot of extra armor and magic resist, even though the game doesn't tell you how much bonuses you get. And then for the inspiration tree, both Celerity and Axiom Arcanist are just situational runes. Celerity really only gets used by like 1 or 2 champions, which is Nunu, Rammus, and Hecarim. They're the only champions that will ever build this rune, and that's pretty much going to be it outside of that. Jhin as well. Jhin as well is another champion that can benefit a lot because of his passive and because of things like Ghost as well. Any champions that can really use Ghost can benefit from Celerity. Singed as well is another one that I'm trying to think of champions off the top of my head, and they just keep going now. But yeah, Celerity, pretty big on some champions, as I mentioned already. There are 5 or 6 champions there that I just mentioned. Singed as well is also pretty big because you get a lot of movement speed with his ultimate and also Ghost. But outside of that, this rune's not really going to help you too much. It's not really going to be a big benefit. It's only very specific champions. Axiom Arcanist, I feel like, is very hit and miss. I've seen a lot of stats of Axiom Arcanist being very, very high. I think because this ability, or this rune, sorry, works with true damage, I think it can be really big for champions like Garen, Darius, and Syndra. I think these are the 3 champions that also, because it's single target, you're going to be getting the extra damage and the extra bonuses. But because your damage gets increased by 5% for AoE abilities, then it actually doesn't make it that good for champions like Victor, for example, which I thought it could be quite good. But because it's in the same tree as Transcendence, and Transcendence gives you a lot of ability haste overall and can reduce your ability cooldowns by quite a lot, then Axiom Arcanist, I think, only gets used on some champions. Obviously, for Darius and Garen, it'll be used as a secondary rune. But for Victor and Syndra, you could use this as the main tree. You can go Sweet Tooth, Axiom Arcanist, something like Ixtali Seajar, for example. And then for your secondary rune, you go Gathering Storm or Bone Plating. That's pretty much it. Outside of that, I've tested it on Soraka. Doesn't really increase your healing by that much, to be honest with you. I think there's much more better runes to take. Dr. Mundo is another one that it could work well on, because you can go Axiom Arcanist with Radiant Virtue, which gives you a crazy amount of healing with both your ultimate and Radiant Virtue as an item. I haven't tested out that yet, but that can definitely be a possibility. But outside of that, it's very unique runes. But yeah, so overall, my opinions on the runes, I'm pretty disappointed overall. I think that there could have been a lot more impactful runes that got added into the game. And to be honest, there hasn't really shifted up the meta too much. I think there are just a few champions that could really benefit a lot from something like Celerity, like Hecarim, for example, got a lot stronger this patch. Outside of that, not really that much difference. Same with Axiom Arcanist. Unshakable just makes tanks a little bit stronger. But like I said, Unshakable being added doesn't actually mean too much because the boots actually got nerfed so much. So that doesn't really mean anything at all. And then for the domination tree, yeah, both Chain Assault and Tyrant are pretty underwhelming. It doesn't actually increase your damage by that much, and some champions will still take Empowered Attack or Cheap Shot if they have a lot of crowd control, or if they auto attack a lot, someone like Ahri, for example. So yeah, that's why I wanted to give you an update on and give you my thoughts on the new runes. As always, if you like the content on this channel, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you go and check out my website, Wild Rift Fire. I've updated all the builds over there for the weekend, and I'll be looking again on Monday/Tuesday, just to give you an update on all the builds back then. So yeah, hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the new rank season climb, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.